The Halbrook Grand Hotel stood in the center of downtown like a monolith of glass and polished stone, glowing against the dark evening sky. It was a monument to excess and influence, 30 floors of shimmering light that announced to the world that this was where the powerful gathered. A lush red carpet stretched from the curb to the entrance, a velvet tongue welcoming the parade of sleek black sedans and luxury SUVs that deposited the city's elite one by one. Inside the car, I sat quietly, my fingers tracing the hem of my navy blue dress. It was a simple garment, modest and elegant, chosen for its comfort rather than its ability to turn heads. To my left sat Daniel, my husband of 30 years and the CEO of Harrington Global. He was busy smoothing the sleeves of his navy suit, the bespoke one he had purchased specifically for tonight's 30th anniversary gala. In the harsh glow of the streetlights, he looked every bit the corporate titan he believed himself to be. Sharp, focused, and entirely untouchable. When he noticed I hadn't moved, he leaned down toward the open door, his voice laced with a familiar, thin-edged impatience. "Susan, come on. We're going to be late. The board members are already inside, and I need to make the rounds before the keynote starts." I nodded quickly and stepped out, the cold evening air brushing against my bare arms. I smoothed my dress instinctively, feeling a sudden, sharp awareness of the small silver bracelet on my wrist, a gift from my sister years ago. As I stepped onto the red carpet, the reality of the event hit me. Almost every woman walking past us was draped in silk and sequins that likely cost more than our first home's down payment. Diamond necklaces caught the light of the paparazzi's flashes, creating a dazzling, blinding aura of wealth. Daniel didn't wait for me. He walked several paces ahead, his gait confident, his eyes already scanning the lobby for potential networking targets. I hurried to catch up, feeling like a ghost trailing in the wake of a king. The lobby was a cathedral of marble and gold. A massive chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a warm, honeyed light over a small orchestra playing softly near the grand staircase. High above the entrance to the ballroom, a large banner stretched across the archway. Harrington Global, 30 years of excellence. "This is bigger than I thought," I murmured, more to myself than to him. Daniel didn't answer right away. He was busy accepting 2 name tags from a polite woman at the registration table. He clipped his own badge, *** Daniel Harrington, CEO ***, to his lapel with a practiced flick of his wrist. Then he handed the second one to me. The small white card read simply, "Susan Harrington, guest." Just guest. No title, no mention of the 3 decades I had spent standing beside him, no acknowledgement of the nights I had spent editing his business plans or the sacrifices I had made so he could focus entirely on his climb. I slipped it onto my dress quietly, the weight of the word feeling heavier than it should have. The ballroom door swung open, revealing a space that felt like a different world. Crystal chandeliers stretched across the ceiling like glowing constellations. Round tables covered in ivory linen filled the room, and waiters moved with feline grace through the crowd, carrying trays of vintage champagne. A jazz band played an elegant melody, but the music was secondary to the hum of conversation. The sound of million-dollar deals being discussed over appetizers. Daniel exhaled slowly, a look of profound satisfaction crossing his face. "This is perfect," he whispered. "What do you mean?" I asked. He didn't look at me. Instead, he placed a hand lightly on my shoulder. Not a gesture of affection, but one of positioning. "Listen, Susan. This is an important night. A lot of senior executives and major investors are here. People I've been courting for months." "I know, Daniel. I'm proud of what we've achieved." He hesitated, his jaw tightening slightly. For a moment, the polished mask of the CEO cracked, and I saw something else, embarrassment. "Just try to stay near the bar or the back tables tonight, okay? I don't want things to get awkward." The word awkward felt like a slap. Awkward? Why would it be awkward? He glanced around the room, making sure no one was listening. "People talk, Susan. They ask questions about backgrounds, about roles in the company. You're a housewife. You've been at home for 30 years. These people speak a different language. I just don't want you to feel out of place." "Out of place," I repeated, the words tasting like ash. "I see. Daniel. Over here." A voice called from the center of the room. It was Mark, our son, standing with his wife, Vanessa. Mark had followed in his father's footsteps, carving out a place for himself in the firm's strategy department. Vanessa, always dressed in the latest high-fashion trends, looked like she had stepped off a runway. Daniel's posture changed instantly. His shoulders straightened, and his professional smile returned. "Just stay near the bar, Susan. I'll come get you later for the photos." And before I could respond, he was gone, weaving through the crowd with the ease of a man who owned the air he breathed. I stood there alone for a moment, a guest, in a room built on a foundation I had helped lay. I watched as Daniel reached Mark and Vanessa. They laughed, clinked glasses, and leaned into a tight circle that clearly had no room for me. I turned slowly toward the bar, ordering a sparkling water just to have something to hold. The bartender gave me a polite, perfunctory smile. He at least saw me. From my vantage point by the bar, I could see the entire ballroom. I saw Daniel holding court with a group of international investors, his hands moving animatedly as he described the vision of Harrington Global. I saw Vanessa leaning in to whisper something to a group of socialites, her eyes occasionally darting toward me with a look of pity that was harder to stomach than Daniel's coldness. Then I saw it. Daniel was talking to a group of board members. One of them asked a question, nodding in my direction. Daniel didn't turn around. He simply shook his head, a dismissive smirk on his lips. I couldn't hear the words over the music, but I could read them clearly on his lips as he addressed the men in the circle. "My wife. Oh, she's just here for the dinner. She doesn't really understand the business side of things. She's more comfortable with the domestic duties." The men laughed. It was a short, sharp sound that cut through the jazz and the clinking of crystal. I looked down at my simple silver bracelet. My father had given it to me when I was 20, back when Daniel was just a young, ambitious apprentice working in my father's jewelry shop. I remembered how he used to look at me then, with eyes full of hunger, not for me, but for the world my father occupied. I had loved him. I had believed in him. I had given him the keys to the kingdom, and tonight he was using those keys to lock me out. I took a sip of my water, the coldness of the liquid matching the sudden, icy clarity in my chest. For 30 years, I had been the silent architect of his success. I had been the one to maintain the image, to manage the fallout of his ego, and to ensure the family remained a cohesive unit. I had played the role of the quiet wife perfectly, but as I watched my husband and my son laugh at my expense in a hotel ballroom paid for by my family's legacy, I realized that the time for silence was over. They saw a maid. They saw a relic. They saw someone who was essentially useless to the bottom line. They were about to find out that the bottom line belonged entirely to me. The jazz music seemed to grate against my nerves as the evening progressed. I remained in my designated exile near the bar, watching the theater of vanity unfold. Daniel was in his element, a master conductor leading an orchestra of powerful men and ambitious women. He moved from one cluster of investors to another, his laughter booming, his gestures expansive. To anyone else, he was the personification of the American dream. The self-made man who had turned a small jewelry trade into a global empire. To me, he was becoming a stranger I no longer recognized, or perhaps, a man I was finally seeing clearly for the first time. Dinner was served with the kind of military precision only a place like the Halbrook Grand could manage. I was seated at a table far from the stage, tucked behind a large floral arrangement of white lilies and orchids. My companions were the spouses of junior executives, women who spoke exclusively about their interior decorators and the difficulties of finding reliable house staff. They treated me with a polite but vacuous kindness, the way one treats a distant relative at a funeral. They knew who I was, or rather, they knew who Daniel said I was, the quiet wife who stayed home. "It must be so nice to have all that free time while Daniel runs the world," one woman remarked, her eyes flicking briefly to my simple silver bracelet before returning to her own designer watch. "I don't know how you do it. I'd be bored to tears just waiting." I offered the small, practiced smile I had perfected over 3 decades. "I find ways to keep busy," I replied softly. "Susan, there you are." Vanessa approached the table, her silk gown whispering against the carpet. She didn't sit. She hovered, looking down at me with an expression that was part pity and part irritation. Mark followed behind her, looking increasingly like a younger, sharper version of his father. "Mom, Dad is about to go up," Mark said, his voice devoid of any real warmth. "You should probably move to the back of the room. It's going to be crowded near the front, and Vanessa and I have seats with the VIPs. It might be difficult for you to navigate." "I'm perfectly fine here, Mark," I said. Vanessa sighed, a sharp, impatient sound. "Susan, don't be difficult. Daniel wants the focus on the company tonight. It's the 30th anniversary. It's about the brand, the growth, the leadership. Having you right there, it doesn't really fit the narrative he's built for the press." The narrative. That was the word they used now. My life, my 30 years of labor, my support. It was all just a detail that didn't fit the current branding. "Go on then," I said, my voice steadier than it had been all night. "Don't let me keep you from your VIP seats." They left without another word, disappearing back into the golden heart of the ballroom. A few moments later, the lights dimmed, and a single spotlight hit the center of the stage. The chatter died down to a respectful hum. The master of ceremonies took the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen, tonight we celebrate a milestone. 30 years ago, a vision was born. A vision that took a humble craft and transformed it into a global powerhouse. Please welcome the man who built it all from the ground up, the chairman and CEO of Harrington Global, Mr. Daniel Harrington." The applause was deafening. Daniel stepped onto the stage, the light catching the sharp lines of his suit and the silver at his temples. He looked magnificent. He looked invincible. He stood at the podium for a long moment, soaking in the adulation, a small, triumphant smile playing on his lips. "Thank you," he began, his voice amplified and resonant. 30 years. It feels like a lifetime ago that I was sitting in a dusty shop, clutching a jeweler's loop, dreaming of something bigger. People often ask me how I did it. How a young man with nothing but ambition built an empire. He paused for dramatic effect. I watched him from behind the lilies, my heart hammering a slow, rhythmic beat against my ribs. "I did it with these hands," he said, holding them up for the crowd to see. "I did it by working 18-hour days when others were sleeping. I did it by making the hard choices, by taking the risks no one else was willing to take. Harrington Global isn't just a company, it's a testament to what one man can achieve when he refuses to accept no for an answer." He went on, detailing the acquisitions, the expansions, the brilliant maneuvers that had defined the last decade. He spoke of the company as if it were a child he had fathered alone, a solo creation born of his singular genius. Then his gaze drifted across the room. He found me. Even from the back, hidden by the flowers, I felt the weight of his stare. It wasn't the look of a husband acknowledging a partner. It was the look of a master noticing a smudge on a window pane. "I see my wife Susan is in the audience tonight," he said, his voice taking on a tone of mocking indulgence. A few people turned their heads, searching for me. She's been there, of course, making sure the house was quiet, the meals were hot, and the errands were run so I could focus on the real work. "Susan, I know you're probably overwhelmed by all the big numbers and the corporate talk tonight. You shouldn't have felt obligated to come. This stage, this room, it's for the builders. For the contributors. For those who understand the grind." A light, tittering laughter rippled through the front rows. I saw Vanessa lean over and whisper something into Mark's ear, and they both broke into broad, mocking grins. "In many ways," Daniel continued, his confidence swelling with the laughter of the crowd, "every successful man needs a reliable domestic staff. And Susan, you've been the most loyal maid a CEO could ask for. But let's leave the business to the professionals, shall we?" He turned back to his speech, dismissed me with a flick of his hand, and began talking about the next 5-year plan. The insult was so complete, so public, and so cold that for a second, I couldn't breathe. The women at my table looked away, suddenly fascinated by their dessert spoons. I felt the heat rising in my neck, but it wasn't the heat of shame. It was the heat of a fire that had been smoldering for 30 years, finally finding oxygen. He had forgotten. He had truly, genuinely forgotten where he came from. He had convinced himself of his own lie. He thought he was the king because he sat on the throne, oblivious to the fact that I was the one who had built the castle. I didn't get up and run. I didn't burst into tears. I sat perfectly still, my eyes fixed on the man on the stage. I thought about the ironclad trust my father had established. I thought about the blockchain encrypted ledgers that held the true history of Harrington Global. I thought about the documents sitting in my clutch, digital keys that could dismantle his world with a single tap. Daniel thought he was delivering a keynote. He didn't realize he was delivering a eulogy for his own career. I reached into my bag and felt the cool surface of my tablet. The countdown had begun. He wanted to talk about the grind. He was about to learn exactly what happens when the gears he ignored finally stop turning. The air in the grand ballroom felt heavy, saturated with the scent of lilies and the sharp, lingering tang of the champagne that flowed so freely at the front tables. Daniel was still speaking, his voice booming through the sound system, weaving a tapestry of self-congratulation. Every word he spoke about his hands-on leadership and his solitary vision was a needle pricking at the skin of my patience. I looked toward the VIP section, where Mark and Vanessa were seated. They were leaning toward each other, their faces glowing in the reflected light of the stage. Vanessa caught someone's eye at another table and made a subtle, dismissive gesture toward the back of the room. Toward me. Mark didn't look back once. He was 28 years old, a man I had raised with every ounce of my soul. Yet he sat there basking in the reflected glory of a lie, seemingly comfortable with the idea that his mother was nothing more than a household appliance. The betrayal from Daniel was expected. It was the slow erosion of a marriage I had felt for years. But the betrayal from my son was a cold, sharp blade. He knew the truth. He had been there as a child when my father, the real founder of the Gemstone legacy, had sat him on his knee and told him that one day, he would help his mother protect what our family had built. I felt a sudden, visceral disconnect from the room. The diamonds, the laughter, the 30 years of excellence banner. It all looked like a cheap stage set. Are you all right, dear? I blinked, coming back to the present. It was the woman sitting next to me, the wife of a mid-level director. Her name was Catherine, and she was looking at me with a mixture of genuine concern and profound awkwardness. She had heard the maid comment. Everyone had. I'm perfectly fine, Catherine, I said, my voice sounding strangely resonant to my own ears. In fact, I've never been more certain of anything in my life. I didn't wait for her to respond. I stood up. The movement was slow and deliberate. A few people at the surrounding tables noticed and whispered, likely expecting me to make a tearful, humiliated exit toward the ballroom doors. I saw Daniel falter for a split second in his speech as he saw me rise, his eyes narrowing behind his designer glasses. He gave a sharp, imperceptible shake of his head, a warning to sit back down and disappear. I didn't head for the doors. I turned toward the stage. As I walked down the center aisle, the room began to quiet in waves. The tittering laughter died out, replaced by a confused, expectant silence. I felt the gaze of hundreds of eyes on my simple navy dress. I could see Vanessa's face change from a smug grin to a mask of irritation, then to genuine confusion. Mark straightened in his seat, his brow furrowing as he watched me approach the front of the room. Susan, what are you doing? Daniel hissed as I reached the edge of the stage. He hadn't turned off the microphone, and his voice carried faintly to the first few rows. Go back to your seat. Don't make this a scene. You're embarrassing yourself. I didn't answer. I climbed the stairs, the sound of my modest heels against the wood sounding like a drumbeat. When I reached the podium, Daniel stepped forward as if to physically block me, but I didn't stop. I walked directly into his space, staring him in the eye with a calm intensity that forced him to take a step back. It was the first time in a decade that I had looked at him not as a husband to be managed, but as an intruder to be removed. Give me the microphone, Daniel, I said. My voice was low, but the podium mic picked it up. Susan, sit down now, he whispered, his face flushed a deep, angry red. I'll deal with you at home. There is no more at home for you, Daniel, I replied. I reached out and took the microphone from the stand. He hesitated, his hands trembling slightly, caught between the desire to stop me and the terror of causing a physical altercation in front of the city's entire business press. He let go. I turned to the audience. The silence was now absolute. I could see the camera operators for the corporate live stream adjusting their focus, sensing that the script had been thrown out the window. My husband just spoke to you about his journey. I began, my voice clear and steady, echoing with a hidden strength I hadn't used in 30 years. He spoke of humble beginnings and an empire built with his own 2 hands. It's a compelling story. It's the kind of story that sells magazines and attracts investors. I paused, looking directly at Mark. He looked like he wanted to vanish into the upholstery of his chair. Vanessa was staring at her phone, her fingers flying across the screen, likely trying to alert the PR team. But Daniel Harrington is a man who has lived a lie for so long that he has begun to believe it himself. I continued. He calls me a maid. He tells you I don't understand the big numbers or the grind of the corporate world. He says I shouldn't have come because this stage is only for those who have contributed to the bottom line. I saw a few board members shifting uncomfortably. Daniel was standing just behind me, a statue of impotent rage. Let's talk about that bottom line, I said, a small, chilling smile touching my lips. Daniel mentioned he started as a jeweler. What he neglected to tell you is whose shop he was working in. He was a 24-year-old apprentice in my father's trade house, a man who had the talent but lacked the means. I was the one who saw that talent. I was the one who convinced my father to give him a chance. And when I married him, my father didn't just give him a wife, he gave him a career. He handed the keys of the Harrington family legacy to a man who had nothing, out of love for me. The room remained frozen. The maid was speaking, and she was rewriting history in real time. For 30 years, I have been the one in the background, I said. I managed the estates, I navigated the family trusts, and I kept the legal foundation of this company secure while Daniel played the role of the public face. I was content to let him have the spotlight, as long as he remembered who provided the stage. I turned slightly to look at Daniel, who was now ghostly pale. But you didn't just forget, Daniel. You grew arrogant. You started to believe that the chair made the man, rather than the man simply occupying the chair. You began to treat the person who built you as an inconvenience to your brand. I looked back at the crowd, my hand reaching into my clutch to feel the tablet. Tonight is indeed a celebration of 30 years, I said. But it is not a celebration of his leadership. It is the anniversary of the day my father made a decision that he secured with more than just a handshake or a paper contract. He was a man of the future, and he left his legacy in a way that cannot be tampered with, cannot be hidden, and most importantly, cannot be claimed by those who haven't earned it. I felt the weight of the room shifting. The pity was gone. The mocking was gone. In its place was a growing, sharp-edged realization that the guest was the only person in the room who actually mattered. Daniel, you asked me to stay near the bar because you didn't want things to get awkward, I said, leaning into the microphone. Well, things are about to get much more than awkward. They're about to get final. The silence in the grand ballroom was no longer polite. It was heavy, vibrating with the collective held breath of 500 people. On stage, I could feel the heat of the spotlights, but I had never felt cooler. I looked down at the front row. Vanessa had finally stopped typing. She sat frozen, her mouth slightly agape, looking at me as if I were a stranger who had just broken into her home. Mark's face was a map of internal conflict, his eyes darting from his father's trembling form to mine. Susan, stop this right now. Daniel managed to grate out, his voice a ragged whisper. He tried to reach for the microphone again, but I pivoted my body, blocking him with a physical certainty that seemed to shock him even more than my words. I've spent 30 years listening to you, Daniel, I said into the microphone, my voice amplified so every corner of the Halbrook Grand could hear. Tonight, you and everyone else will listen to me. I reached into my small silk clutch and pulled out a slim, high-end tablet. The screen glowed to life, reflecting in my eyes. I didn't look at Daniel. I looked at the board of directors seated at the very first table. Many of you in this room are here because you believe in the stability of Harrington Global, I began. You believe in the contracts, the assets, and the leadership structure that has been presented to you for 3 decades. But Daniel's version of history isn't just a lie of omission. It is a legal fantasy. I tapped an icon on the screen, and the massive projection behind me, the one that had been displaying a glossy 30 years logo, flickered and changed. Instead of marketing graphics, a complex, scrolling interface appeared. It was a digital ledger, lines of encrypted data moving with hypnotic precision. My father, Elias Harrington, was a man who understood the value of a gemstone, Not just its beauty, but its permanence, I explained to the stunned crowd. He also understood that the world was changing. Long before the term blockchain became a corporate buzzword, he worked with Swiss cryptographers to establish the Harrington Trust. He didn't want his legacy to be a pile of paper that could be burned, lost, or forged. He wanted it to be immutable. I heard a sharp intake of breath from the lead board member. These were people who understood technology and finance. They knew exactly what they were looking at. Every share of this company, every piece of real estate in the Harrington portfolio, and every patent under our name is tied to a private, decentralized ledger, I continued. And the primary key, the only key with the authority to trigger a leadership change or a dissolution of assets, belongs to the Harrington bloodline. I turned back to Daniel. He looked like a man watching his own execution. The arrogance that had fueled his maid comment only minutes ago had evaporated, replaced by a hollow, sickening realization. Daniel, you have spent the last few years convincing yourself that I was just the help, I said, my voice dropping to a level of lethal calm. You started treating the family accounts like your personal playground. You moved funds to offshore accounts to hide them from the domestic staff, thinking I wouldn't notice the fluctuations. You even started drafting a new will, one that would leave the majority of the firm to Vanessa's family interests, bypassing the very trust that built this building. That's not true, Daniel stammered, but his eyes were wide with the guilt of a man caught mid-theft. It's all on the chain, Daniel, I replied, pointing to the screen behind me. Every transaction you thought was private. Every signature you tried to bypass. The system doesn't just record assets, it records intent. And your intent has been a betrayal of the very person who gave you everything. I looked at Mark. My son flinched. And you, Mark, I said, the pain finally coloring my tone. I watched you laugh tonight. I watched you sit there while your father humiliated the woman who taught you how to speak, how to think, and how to carry yourself with a dignity you clearly haven't mastered. You chose the narrative over the truth. You chose the shadow over the source. The room remained deathly still. Vanessa gripped the arms of her chair so hard her knuckles were white. The maid was no longer in the back of the room. She was the judge, the jury, and the one holding the keys to their future. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of 30 years, I said, returning my focus to the audience. And it will be. It will be the night we celebrate the return of Harrington Global to its rightful owner. My father's trust was conditional. It allowed for a CEO to manage the day-to-day operations, provided they remained in good standing with the majority shareholder. I paused for a second, my finger hovering over a final button on the tablet. Daniel Harrington is no longer in good standing. Susan, wait, Daniel pleaded, his hand reaching out in a desperate, pathetic gesture. As of this moment, I said, tapping the screen with a sharp, final click, the Harrington failsafe has been activated. The private keys assigned to Daniel Harrington for all corporate and personal accounts have been revoked. His access to the Harrington headquarters is blocked. His company-issued vehicles are being remotely disabled. A series of red lines slashed across the projection behind me. And most importantly, I added, looking Daniel directly in the eye, the board is hereby notified that the position of CEO is vacant. I am exercising my right as the 100% beneficiary of the Harrington Trust to dissolve the current leadership structure, effective immediately. Daniel's knees buckled. He grabbed the edge of the podium to keep from falling, the microphone letting out a sharp, feedback-induced shriek that echoed like a scream through the ballroom. I stepped back, handing the microphone to the master of ceremonies, who stood nearby looking like he had just seen a ghost. I didn't need the mic anymore. The message had been delivered. The guest was finished speaking. I walked to the edge of the stage. Mark stood up, his face pale and desperate. Mom, please. We can talk about this. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I walked past him, my simple navy dress brushing against the silk of his expensive suit. I didn't look at Vanessa, who was now frantically trying to call her lawyer, only to realize that her phone, tied to a company plan, had likely been disconnected. As I reached the center aisle, I stopped and looked back at the room one last time. The chandeliers were still beautiful, the lilies still smelled sweet, but the hierarchy had been dismantled. I had been his shadow for 30 years, ensuring every light hit him just right. Tonight, I had stepped into the light, and in doing so, I had cast the only shadow that mattered. I walked toward the doors of the Halbrook Grand, my head held high. For the first time in 3 decades, I wasn't Susan Harrington, the quiet wife. I wasn't the maid Daniel needed to keep his house in order. I was Susan Harrington, the architect of an empire. And as I stepped out into the cool night air, leaving the wreckage of Daniel's ego behind me, I felt the most dangerous thing a woman like me can feel. I felt free. And I was just getting started. The morning after the gala, the silence of the Harrington estate felt different. For decades, the quiet of this house had been something I curated, a soft buffer to protect Daniel from the friction of the outside world. I had been the one to ensure the carpets were vacuumed to dampen his footsteps and the kitchen hummed only with the preparation of his favorite meals. But as I sat in the sun-drenched breakfast nook, clutching a cup of coffee, the silence was no longer a service I provided. It was a victory. The news had traveled faster than I expected. My tablet, resting on the marble table, buzzed incessantly with notifications. Financial journals were already dissecting the ballroom dissolution, and the stock price of Harrington Global was fluctuating wildly as the market tried to make sense of a ghost suddenly taking the wheel. I didn't care about the stock price, not yet. I cared about the ledger. I heard the front door chime. It wasn't the rhythmic, assertive knock of a guest. It was the frantic, uneven hammering of someone who had lost their keys. Or, more accurately, someone whose digital biometric access had been wiped from the system. I didn't move. I took a slow sip of my coffee, feeling the warmth spread through my chest. The hammering continued for a full minute before moving to the side entrance, then finally to the glass doors leading to the patio. There stood Daniel. He was still wearing the navy suit from the night before, though it was now rumpled and stained with what looked like sweat and desperation. His silver hair, usually perfectly coiffed, was a chaotic mess. He looked 20 years older than the man who had stood on that stage calling me a maid. He beat his fists against the reinforced glass, his mouth moving in silent, jagged shouts. I set my coffee down and stood up. I walked slowly to the glass door, the tablet in my hand. I didn't open it. I simply stood there, inches away from him, separated by the very transparency he had used to hide me for years. I tapped the screen of my tablet and held it up for him to see. It showed the Harrington Trust's primary dashboard. A bright red banner at the top read, "Tenancy expired." Daniel's face crumpled. He stopped shouting and pressed his forehead against the cool glass. I could see the tremors in his hands. He was a man who had defined himself by the walls around him. And now those walls had officially turned their backs on him. "You can't do this, Susan," he croaked, his voice barely audible through the glass. 30 years. We have a life here." "You had a life here, Daniel," I said, my voice calm and projected. "But you told 500 people last night that I was just the help. And as the owner of this house, I've decided your employment is terminated." "It was a joke," he pleaded, his eyes darting around the patio as if searching for a lawyer to materialize out of the rosebushes. "I was playing to the crowd. You know how the industry is. They want the self-made man story. I didn't mean it." "The problem, Daniel, is that you've told that lie so often you forgot it was a script. You started believing you were the author when you were just the actor I hired." I turned the tablet around again. "The failure safe didn't just revoke your CEO title. It triggered the audit. I spent the night looking through the offshore transfers you made into Vanessa's family accounts. $2 million in the last 6 months alone. You weren't just neglecting me. You were stealing from the legacy my father built." Daniel went silent. The panic in his eyes turned into a cold, hard dread. He knew the blockchain didn't lie. He knew that every digital footprint he had left in those hidden accounts was now a tether around his neck. "Where is Mark?" I asked. "He's at the hotel," Daniel muttered, looking defeated. She's hysterical. Her family is furious. They think we've ruined them." "Mark made his choice," I said. "He stood by and laughed while you insulted the woman who gave him everything. If he wants to live in Vanessa's world, he can see if her family's strategy can build him a new life. Because he won't find one here." I walked away from the door, returning to my coffee. I didn't look back as Daniel slumped to the ground on the other side of the glass. I had spent 30 years looking back, checking to see if he was comfortable, if he was happy, if he was satisfied. That part of me was gone. An hour later, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. It wasn't a company car. Those had all been reclaimed by the trust's automated recovery system. It was a private security detail I had hired. 2 men in discreet suits stepped out and walked toward Daniel. They didn't use force. They simply stood over him until he realized the inevitability of the moment. He stood up, cast one last hollow look at the house, and allowed them to escort him to the gate. The house was mine again. Not as a domestic space to be managed, but as the headquarters of a new era. I sat back down at the table and opened a new file on the tablet. It was time to contact the board of directors. They would be terrified, expecting a vengeful widow to burn the company down out of spite. They didn't realize that I didn't want to destroy Harrington Global. I wanted to refine it. I wanted to strip away the vanity, the bloat, and the lies that Daniel had layered over the core of the business. I began typing the first draft of my internal memo to the staff. Asterisk to the employees of Harrington Global. For 30 years you have seen one face at the front of this company. Today, you see the mind that kept it standing. My name is Susan Harrington, and the era of the self-made man is over. It is time to talk about the truth. Asterisk. As I worked, I felt a strange sense of alignment. I watched as the realization settled in. They weren't just dealing with a scorned wife. They were dealing with a major fraud investigation that I had already solved for them. Daniel was the face of Harrington Global. I continued, walking slowly along the side of the table. He was a talented salesman, I'll grant him that. But a salesman is not an architect. For 30 years I have managed the risk assessments, the legal compliance, and the internal structures that allowed him to play the hero. I know where every cent is buried because I was the one who designed the shovel. So, what is it you want, Susan? Arthur asked, his voice softer now, more respectful. A settlement? A quiet divorce? We can arrange for a generous package if you agree to reinstate a traditional leadership structure. I stopped walking and looked Arthur directly in the eyes. I let a small, sharp smile play on my lips. You misunderstand the situation, Arthur. I am not here to negotiate my exit. I am here to announce your new reality. I tapped a command on my tablet. The monitors shifted from financial data to a new organizational chart. My name was at the very top, in a box that was double the size of the others. I am exercising the Harrington mandate, I declared. Under the terms of the original charter, the 100% beneficiary of the trust assumes the role of executive chair with absolute veto power over all board appointments and corporate strategy. I am not asking for a seat at the table. I own the table. And as of this moment, I am appointing myself as the interim CEO until a suitable, honest candidate can be found. A murmur of protest began, but I silenced it with a single gesture. If anyone feels that their loyalty to Daniel outweighs their duty to the shareholders, you are welcome to resign today. Your severance will be handled by the trust's automated system. But be warned, the audit is ongoing. Anyone found to have been complicit in Daniel's diversions will not be leaving with a check. They will be leaving with a subpoena. The protests died instantly. These were people who valued their yachts and their reputations above all else. They saw the writing on the wall, and it was written in my father's encrypted code. Now, I said, taking my seat at the head of the table for the first time. Let's talk about the rebranding. Harrington Global will no longer be a monument to one man's vanity. We are returning to the craft. We are resecuring our supply lines. And we are terminating all contracts associated with the Cole family interests. The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end of it, the board wasn't just compliant. They were eager. They saw a woman who had more command of the company's intricacies than Daniel ever had. They saw a leader who didn't need to shout to be heard. As the board members filed out, Arthur lingered. He looked at me with a mixture of sadness and admiration. Your father would have been proud, Susan. He always said you were the one with the jeweler's eye. He just worried you were too kind to use it. I was Arthur, I said, leaning back in the chair. But Daniel taught me that even the finest diamond needs a little pressure to reach its full potential. Once the room was empty, I allowed myself a moment of stillness. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, golden shadows across the boardroom. My phone buzzed. It was a message from an unknown number, but the tone was unmistakably Mark. Mom, please. Dad is staying in a motel. Vanessa's parents have cut us off. They say they're being audited. We have nothing. Can we just talk? I'm your son. I stared at the screen for a long time. The maid in me wanted to reach out, to fix the mess, to comfort the child I had raised. But the architect knew better. Mark hadn't reached out because he missed his mother. He reached out because the gold had stopped flowing. He hadn't apologized for the laughter in the ballroom. He hadn't acknowledged the lie. I didn't block the number. I simply deleted the message. I stood up and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the city. Below me, the lights were flickering on, a million points of energy and ambition. For 30 years, I had been the one making sure the lights stayed on for someone else. Tonight, I was the one deciding which ones stayed on, and which ones went dark. I picked up my tablet and made one final call for the day, to the PR firm I had hired. "This is Susan Harrington," I said. "Send the press release. The one titled The Return of the Founder. And make sure you include the photo of the gemstone shop from 1996. People need to remember how this started if they're going to understand how it ends." I hung up, feeling the cool weight of my father's silver bracelet on my wrist. The era of the maid was officially over. The era of the Harrington had begun. And as I looked at my reflection in the glass, I didn't see a 60-year-old widow. I saw a woman who was finally, for the first time in her life, exactly where she was meant to be. The first snow of the season began to fall as I stood on the sidewalk outside the modest brick storefront on Pearl Street. This was the original heart of the legacy. The small jewelry shop where my father had taught me how to tell a genuine ruby from a synthetic, and where Daniel had once stood behind the counter, eager and desperate to impress. For 30 years, this building had been a footnote in the glossy corporate brochure of Harrington Global. Today, it was the only property I hadn't folded back into the multi-billion-dollar conglomerate. It was mine, separate and sacred. The brass handle felt cold beneath my palm, but as I stepped inside, the familiar scent of polishing wax and old wood wrapped around me like a warm embrace. The shop was empty, the display cases dark, but the air felt charged with a quiet, dignified peace. I walked to the back, to the small office where a single safe sat bolted to the floor. I didn't need a key. I used the same biometric tablet that had dismantled Daniel's world. A soft click echoed in the silence, and the heavy door swung open. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, the physical backup to the blockchain, and a small velvet pouch. I opened the pouch and let a single, uncut diamond spill into my hand. It was the Harrington star, a stone my father had found in his youth and refused to cut, claiming its beauty lay in its raw, unpolished potential. "He was right, Father," I whispered. "Some things are better left as they truly are." My phone vibrated in my pocket. I expected another desperate plea from Mark or a legal threat from the shells of Daniel's defense team. Instead, it was a notification from the primary trust account. The automated liquidation of Daniel's remaining personal assets was complete. The penthouse, the vintage cars, the club memberships, all gone to satisfy the debts he had accrued trying to hide his theft. I sat at my father's old desk and opened my laptop. The morning headlines were dominated by my face. "The Silent Founder Speaks," one read. "Susan Harrington, the woman behind the empire," said another. The narrative had shifted. The world no longer saw a maid or a housewife. They saw a titan who had played the longest game in corporate history. A shadow crossed the frosted glass of the front door. A moment later, the bell chimed. I didn't look up. I knew the rhythm of that walk. It was heavy, hesitant, stripped of the arrogant stride that had once echoed through the Halbrook Grand. Daniel stood in the doorway. He wasn't wearing navy today. He was in an old coat I recognized from 20 years ago, one I had kept in the back of the attic, because I was the one who managed the storage. He looked at the empty shop, his eyes red-rimmed and hollow. "I knew you'd be here," he said, his voice cracking. "It's where we started, Daniel," I replied calmly, still looking at the uncut diamond in my palm. It seemed fitting that this is where we would finally end. He walked closer, stopping a few feet from the desk. He didn't try to sit. The lawyers say there's no way back. The blockchain, the Swiss accounts, you blocked everything. I can't even get a credit card, Susan. I'm living in a motel that smells like mildew. You told me that stage was only for those who contribute to the bottom line. I said, finally lifting my gaze to meet his. I simply took you at your word. You contributed lies and theft. My bottom line has no room for those. I was your husband, he whispered, a desperate attempt to appeal to a ghost of an emotion I no longer felt. You were a man I chose to share my life with, I corrected. And you spent the last decade trying to erase the very person who gave you that life. You didn't just betray our marriage, you betrayed the craft. You turned my father's legacy into a house of cards built on your own vanity. I didn't destroy you, Daniel. I just stopped holding up the walls for you. He looked down at his hands, the hands he had boasted about building an empire with. They were shaking. What about Mark? He's your son. He has nothing. Vanessa's father is facing indictment for the shell companies, and she's already filing for divorce. Mark is a pariah in the industry. Mark is an adult, I said, my voice hardening. He laughed while his father insulted his mother. He sat in a VIP chair while I was relegated to the back of the room as a guest. He needs to learn what it's like to build something from nothing, without the Harrington name to protect him. If he has the talent he claims to have, he'll survive. If not, then he was just another unearned asset I had to liquidate. Daniel let out a long, broken sigh. The realization that there was no mercy left to squeeze from me finally took hold. He turned to leave, but stopped at the door. Why the smile, Susan? He asked, looking back. Even on the stage that night, you weren't angry. You were just smiling. Because for 30 years, I wondered if you would ever remember who I was, I said. And in that moment, when you called me a maid, I realized you never knew me at all. I wasn't smiling because of the revenge, Daniel. I was smiling because I finally realized I didn't need your recognition to be powerful. I already was. He walked out into the snow, the bell chiming one last time behind him. I returned the Harrington star to its pouch and locked the safe. I walked to the front of the shop and flipped the sign on the door to open. I wasn't going to sell the building. I was going to reopen it. Not as a corporate headquarters, but as a school. A place where young jewelers could learn the integrity of the stone and the weight of a legacy. I would be the one teaching them. As I looked out at the street, a black sedan pulled up, not for an escort, but to take me to the first board meeting of the new Harrington Global. I checked my reflection in the window one last time. My silver hair was caught in the wind, and my simple navy dress was covered by a heavy wool coat. I looked at my wrist. The silver bracelet was still there, glowing softly in the winter light. I had been a shadow, a ghost, a maid, and a guest. But those were just roles I had played. Today, the performance was over. The silent architect had stepped into the sun, and the empire she built was finally her own. I stepped into the car and didn't look back. The city was waiting, the market was watching, and for the first time in 60 years, I knew exactly what the next chapter would be. I wasn't just the one paying for everything anymore. I was the one who owned it all.